This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Welcome back, everyone. In this video, we're going to have a discussion about mirrorless. So unless you've been living under a rock, I think it's fairly clear that the DSLR is kind of a thing of the past, and I think Sony has a lot to do with this. But you look at other camera companies as well that are traditionally known for their DSLRs, people like Nikon and Canon, we're not seeing much new from them. In fact, I'd go out on a limb and say we may have seen the last of the DSLR. But what does this mean to us as photographers, and more importantly, why? So if we think about this in the history of photography, well, throughout photography's history, there's always been innovation, there's always been improvements, and there's always been change. I oversimplify this, but you look at the early days of photography, we went from shooting glass plates to shooting film to today we're shooting digital. There's also been innovations with cameras as well. Early cameras were pretty massive because you needed a large sheet of film to get the best quality, but this changed over the years too. 35mm ends up being the defining format. We move into digital, we have the DSLR, and today we've got these mirrorless cameras. Now, what I want to pick apart in this video is within the context of photography, I think that change has to have two sides of it to be legitimate. So first of all, it has to be something that's innovative, something that we've never seen before, that enables us to do something we've never done before. And I think secondly, it has to be adopted by photographers. In other words, it has to be so useful that people actually want to go use it, right? So if you look at the early days of digital photography, I'm talking about when Kodak was doing their experiments to see that if digital was indeed a viable imaging option. Well, the first experiments they did were in 1975. They were not adopted at the time. It was highly innovative, but it didn't provide anything that was going to either one, be affordable, two, be useful for photographers to actually do something. It took digital technology another 30 years to get to that point. So I think that's an example of what I'm talking about. You have innovation, you have change, but what really makes an impact? What we've seen with mirrorless cameras, I'm going to argue that it has made a major impact. Now, Sony in particular has been at the forefront of this, I would argue, for actually a number of years. They had the digital video cameras, the early Mavicas that came along, but what was significant was when they acquired Minolta in 2006 and started a trajectory with a plan behind it that most people don't realize that has really taken over the industry. And regardless of what you think of Sony cameras or lenses, you cannot deny that they have fundamentally impacted every company in business today. Every one of them. The most obvious would be Canon and Nikon. They're in a position where they are actually having to gut and reinvent their entire systems. This is difficult for two reasons. One, it's very expensive for the manufacturer, and what makes it really hard is it's really difficult for the consumer because it's not like you can bring your old lenses over. It's a whole new system that you've got to buy into now. That's a huge hurdle to get over. I also think it's important to talk about innovation versus culmination. So it's one thing to come out with something that's brand new that people adopt. It's another thing to be someone who comes along and takes on that and improves it and takes it to the next level. Let me give you an example. So if we go back to the earliest days of 35mm photography, this is one of my favorite things ever. So this is a Leica 1A. This particular model is from 1929, but it's still pretty early. We've got the collapsible lens on here. There's not a lot of automation going on. This is a fully manual camera. Whether you know this camera or not, there are some very significant things. So really quick, and I'll do a whole video on this one day because it's actually an interesting story. So you've got this guy, Oscar Barnack, and he works for Leica, which at the time is making microscopes, optics. He has this idea for a camera. Oscar is a photographer. He wanted something small because he likes to hike, he likes to shoot landscapes, but he has an asthma issue. Now, there were small portable cameras at that time, but Oscar envisioned something that had a much higher quality to it. And this was difficult because you think back in those days, you had film size being very important. So to get the highest quality, you're going to want to have an 8x10 or larger sheet of film. Using 35mm was kind of an edgy idea back then. So what Barnack does is he takes 35mm movie film or motion picture film. And if you've ever seen a movie projector, you know that that film runs vertically. What he did is he changed that horizontally to maximize the space on it, and essentially what we have is the format that everybody calls full frame today, which was 35mm film, but the exact dimensions, the 24x36, 2:3 aspect ratio, that's the same thing you see in any any modern digital camera. So this camera was extremely innovative for two reasons. First of all, it was very portable, gave you an incredible image quality. Second of all, it pretty much dictated the format that we're all still into. Of course, over the years, Leica made improvements with this camera. This one didn't even have a rangefinder. It just has a viewfinder and distance is marked on the lens. You've got to figure it all out. The rangefinder changed that and became fairly popular. And well, what happened after that? Well, Canon and Nikon had rangefinder lines. So they continued to sort of culminate, but they were following the initial innovation. Now, I know you're thinking, nice history lesson, Ted. What does this have to do with mirrorless cameras? Well, we're going to break that down as well. In fact, I just kind of noticed that my first Sony camera, my NEX7, is pretty much the exact same size, a little bit smaller even than the Leica 1A. Anyway, we're going to get into this, and I want to talk about this in the context of mirrorless. Real quick, though, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor today, who are the awesome folks over at Squarespace.com. I am actually redesigning my personal website right now, and I'm going to be using Squarespace. So I've been sharing a lot of images with you guys in these videos. This is something that I want to share more of, be able to put links and things to when I have collections made. Squarespace is an awesome place to do that. It really is the easiest way to build a website. You can build an online portfolio. You can even build an e-commerce store on here. The tools have really gotten good. How easy is Squarespace to use? Well, you're going to start with one of their award-winning templates. Now, all of these templates are customizable. Your content is separate from the template, so you can change the entire look. If you feel like you need a complete refresh or you're not sure on something, you can get things to look exactly like you want them. What good is a website if nobody's looking at it? Well, Squarespace have the right social tools and email integrations in here so you can do your own website promotion as well. My favorite part of Squarespace, well, it's really intuitive. So if you can drag and drop a folder of images, you can build a photo gallery. It's that easy. You can easily go into the settings to customize everything to your liking, hook it up to your own domain. In fact, they sell those too, and you are in business. So head over to Squarespace using the link below this video, and you can try it out for absolutely free. And when you do decide that Squarespace is right for you, I can save you an additional 10% on your first order by using offer code AOP. So once again, offer code AOP. And I want to give a special shout out and thanks to the awesome folks at Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Okay, so I've talked about rangefinder technology, but obviously another major innovation in photography was the use of the Reflex Mirror. This actually came along pretty early. There were some larger format cameras that involved mirrors, but in terms of 35mm, I think one of the significant moves was when Exacta started putting it into their 35mm cameras. This was an interesting design because it wasn't an eye-level viewfinder, it was a waist level, so you would look down like you would out of a TLR, even though it was an SLR, and you had through-the-lens viewing. Of course, there were many cameras around that time that were using mirrors as a single reflex setup, but I think very significantly was 1959 with the original Nikon F. This evolved their entire system, which eventually evolved into the digital cameras we use today. This is my well-loved Nikon F3 that I've had for years, but you can see in here, once you start having the single reflex setup, when you get into things like metering and then later autofocus, this design adapts really well. Of course, as we move into digital, the SLR stays intact, and really the digital sensor is what has replaced the film, but it became cost-effective, the quality was good enough, and this opened up a whole new set of possibilities for photographers. And this goes on for a number of years. Sure, cameras have small improvements that make them better, but then there's a significant event that happens, it was very quietly at first, around 2006 when Sony acquires Minolta. I don't think that people recognize the significance of these early Sony cameras. So you may remember the EMount bodies, which were essentially SLR-type setups. Sony called them SLT, or single lens translucent setups. So basically the mirror has a beam splitter. It still used a separate sensor for the autofocus, but their sensor introduced phase detection autofocus, which with contrast detection gave you this perfect best of both worlds where you had speed and accuracy. And this was really the trajectory that Sony were going on. Then they introduced the EMount, the NEX series of cameras. I believe the first one was the NEX3. This is actually the NEX7, which is one where they started to get a lot of things right. Now think about it for a second. We do not have a mirror. The sensor is exposed. This is an APS-C size sensor. This was an incredible camera when it came out. This was 24 megapixels, which in that time was a pretty decent resolution. But the whole idea of foregoing the mirror means a lot of things. First of all, you have to have some kind of electronic viewfinder because you have a full real-time data readout that's coming off of the sensor. Now, this is very important because this is also going to require way more battery power than we initially were using with DSLRs. So you also might recognize the very much compact nature of these cameras. They're small, and so this was a lot to do, and it did take a while for Sony to realize this. It allowed you to do things like full-time autofocus. You could do video very easily with better metering, better white balance. These were really incredible cameras when they came out. The biggest problem that we had, and I dealt with this for years, starting with this camera, was overheating with video. And overheating in some situations with stills, and the EVFs weren't very good, and the battery life wasn't very strong. But over the next 10 years, this starts to evolve to where we are today. And I think the culmination of this was with the A7 III. Now, this was not the first full-frame camera that Sony produced, but I think this was the camera model where it all kind of came together. Combine this with the variation models that Sony produced. So, for instance, the A7S series and the A7R, and you had high-resolution cameras. You had cameras that were optimized for low-light sensitivity. That has really evolved into a video lineup, and Sony are starting to really dictate where everyone is going with this. Like I said before, this is where we are today. You have Nikon and Canon that have pretty much abandoned the whole idea of DSLRs. They're designing entirely new systems from the ground up in a very short amount of time, where Sony has had pretty much at least a 10-year head start on this. Another thing that's interesting, and I only know this because I have met some of the people at Sony in person, and I do know that it takes probably 3 to 5 years to design any camera, which is always interesting because today we have the evolution of the rumor websites, and of course, when one camera comes out, so for instance, last year was pretty much the year of the flagship. So we saw the Sony A1, then that followed with the Canon R3, and then Nikon with the Z9. And I remember seeing on there, boy, the other companies have to answer to this. Well, the answer has probably been in development for a number of years. It's not like they can just pop something out in a month. But my point is that who's driving this and who's chasing the trends? And it's not just camera bodies. If you look at any lens that Sony has released in the last 3 years, almost all of them now have adopted an electromagnetic rail system for any movement that comes with the lens elements to acquire focus. So this is how you can boast these outrageous specs of 25 or higher frames per second that you're able to adjust the autofocus, and you're able to have the lens actually silently realize this in almost real time. And this is outstanding. There are other camera manufacturers that use rail system in their lenses. However, you still have motors that are driven with some kind of rotational actuator, which ultimately puts a speed limit on what you can do with the lens unless you're able to just drive it harder from the camera and use more power. I'm not saying that other companies don't have good optical systems. They actually do. There are some incredible lenses on the market today, but we're talking about speed, which has been the trend. What makes this really exciting to see is that, well, with the trend of speed, we have definitely enabled things on a camera that we couldn't do before that are useful for photographers, but with speed, this has been particularly useful for the niches of photographers that involve things like wildlife or sports. Professional use where you're going to need to capture a lot of motion really quickly. I don't think that necessarily on the consumer level it's going to be something that's as useful unless you just love to spray and pray and go through literally hundreds of images at the end of a session. So what really interests me about where we are now? So remember earlier on in this video, I said that there's basically two sides to innovation to make something that actually is going to become adopted. You have to have something that's innovative, an idea, and then it also has to have something about it that makes it useful for photographers to want to adopt. I think we're clearly seeing that now with mirrorless. The DSLR sales, you can look at all the number charts, they're indicating that mirrorless really is the future. This is what people are starting to adopt too. And while the possibilities of things like video or real-time autofocus or fast shooting really interest me, they're not things that I necessarily use a lot. I think with video, the thing that we're pushing right now is higher resolution or 8K. I don't think that that works for my workflow. It certainly requires computers that I don't have, and it is a viewing that nobody is going to see necessarily on YouTube at this point in time. Resolution may come one day. I just think it's a little early right now. And then I think on the other side with still photos, while I'm really impressed with the speed gains that we have with things, I'm not a photojournalist, and I personally don't shoot a lot of wildlife, so it's not something I necessarily need personally, But I believe that we are only scratching the surface. When you have the full data readout off of the sensor, this is stuff that we've never been able to do before, and you go for the most obvious options, things like speed or video work. But what's going to come next is what really interests me. And if I had to put my money bet on a specific company, I think it would be the one with the plan. I think it would be Sony, and it's really going to be interesting to see what we find in the next couple of years in terms of technology that we're able to use. I would love to hear your thoughts, so drop me a comment below, and we'll see you in the next video. Until then, later.